Hello everyone. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are meeting on and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to respectfully recognise that this research project was undertaken on Ngunnawal country, and I would like to extend this respect to all First Nations people today. My name is Luella Reynolds, and I graduated from the Master of Cultural Materials Conservation at the University of Melbourne in 2020. I currently work as a conservation assistant at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. The title of this presentation is called Make, Do and Paint, an examination into the material choices of Australian women war artists. For the completion of my master's last year, I undertook thesis research from a paintings conservation perspective into the subject of Australian women war artists. I was interested in collecting information concerning how personal circumstance, choice, and supply affected the materiality of the work these artists produced during a period of unique historical interest. To facilitate this research, I conducted a selective materials survey into the art collection at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. This was achieved with the assistance of Alana Treasure, the Senior Paintings Conservator at the Memorial. The survey collected information concerning subject matter, scale, and location, allowing me to expand upon my research, which had up until that point been largely digital-based for a significant portion of the year due to COVID restrictions. It also provided an opportunity to review and update catalogue information and photographic records for the Memorial's management system. Today, I will be discussing my methodology and findings and reflecting upon the contextual importance of archival research, artistic intent, as well as materiality concerning the ongoing study and care of Australian artwork. The title of this presentation, Make, Do and Paint, was inspired by the innovation and artistic practice of women war artists and their use of materials during the Second World War. The phrase make, do and mend was first used in 1943 by the British Ministry of Information when they released a campaign of pamphlets encouraging ways in which women could be innovative with food, clothing, and resources during periods of harsh rationing. As such, the expression of making do is often associated with women's contribution to the war effort. However, the sentiment could also be applied to the creation of art during a period where the supply of artist materials was also heavily affected by the circumstances of war. For Australian women painters of the 1940s, their ability to be artists, their subject matter, and their material choices were undoubtedly influenced by the cultural and historical aspects of the time. Not only did women of this era have to contend with societal pressures related to marriage, education, and class, but factors related to the Second World War also affected their ability to source materials and create art. Despite this, or even because of it, Australia's modernist art period produced a significant cohort of innovative women artists such as Grace Cossington Smith, Margaret Preston, and Joy Hester, just to name a few. Many of these women painted scenes related to the circumstances of the Second World War, however only 3 would be appointed as official war artists. Australia's Official War Artist Scheme is an ongoing initiative established for the purposes of creating personal and informed artistic depictions of Australia's involvement in international conflicts and peacekeeping missions. The scheme was originally initiated during the First World War and is still currently operated by the Australian War Memorial today, making it one of the longest-running and largest commissioning art programs in Australia. Nora Heysen was the first woman employed as an official war artist. Her appointment in 1943 took her close to the conflict in the South Pacific, as well as to Sydney and Queensland. Heysen's engagement helped facilitate equal pay for male and female artists, as well as the assignment of official ranks and titles for women artists. Heysen's appointment also prompted the commission of 2 more women artists before the end of the war. These artists were Stella Bowen, who painted Australian personnel, primarily in London, and Sybil Craig, who painted women on the home front working at the Maribyrnong Munitions Factory in Melbourne. Together, these women created almost 400 drawings and paintings under the War Artist Scheme that is still held by the Memorial today. Although much has been written on the imagery and the circumstances surrounding the work of women artists during wartime, considerably less has been discussed concerning their specific use of materials in relation to supply and practice. One reason for this research gap for a substantial amount of art in general is partially due to the extensive nature of materials examination in technical art history research. A comprehensive investigation into the materials and techniques present within a work of art may be conducted using forms of scientific examination such as X-radiography, ultraviolet and infrared radiation, as well as pigment and fibre analysis. Such forms of scientific investigation can be expensive, invasive, and time-intensive to perform on large collections for the purposes of general material identification. Without proper cause, this research may also be deemed unnecessary, particularly when established knowledge from digitised collection catalogues can be utilised instead. Catalogue information as a digital resource can be extremely beneficial for data-driven research concerning the materiality of museum objects. However, catalogue entry is not flawless and can be susceptible to human error. In conjunction with the catalogue information, performing a collection survey by site is a non-invasive method of data collection that could confirm a variety of materials and techniques. This type of methodology can be a useful tool to address this gap in data for both collection management as well as ongoing art history research. In their paper, Beyond a Collection of Data, What We Can Learn from Documentary Sources on Artist Materials and Techniques, Leslie Carlisle describes multidisciplinary information as the approach we must turn to in order to understand the purpose of the materials we find. The diagram on the right has been adapted from Barrett and Stuhlik's integrated approach for the study of painting techniques model from the same volume of papers. It proposes an interdisciplinary approach involving the following actions related to the study of a painting: procuring art history knowledge through archival research, utilising people with existing expertise to identify artistic techniques, and employing scientific examination for a more in-depth identification and understanding of materials. Although the use of scientific analysis was not viable during the project, preliminary, non-invasive identification using reflective and raking light was utilised to identify materials and artistic techniques during the collection survey. This was achieved with my own personal knowledge, having an undergraduate background in fine arts and painting, as well as the conservation expertise of senior painting conservator Alana Treasure, who assisted throughout the survey. However, it is important to consider that identification of materials using personal expertise has its limitations within research. For the basis of this survey, the basic identification, primarily of support materials, was able to be confirmed with the pre-existing knowledge at hand. Following this research gap, I aim to understand from a conservation perspective what materials these women were utilising throughout their commissions and why. The questions of interest were: how did personal circumstances, war and supply physically affect the material practice of these artists? Additionally, what conclusions can be drawn from collecting data on media, supports, scale, tools, budget, subject matter, and geographical location? This involved an interdisciplinary approach grounded in the conservation discipline. The aim was to extract meaning from the materiality of objects through an integrated research methodology, illustrated in the diagram shown. First, we have the collection items of interest, that is, the paintings by Hyson, Bowen and Craig acquired under the War Artist Scheme. This leads us to the methodology used: art historical research, archival research, and a collection survey that synthesized data from the digital collection catalogue and object examination. This corresponds with the information sought, that is, insight into the cultural and historical circumstances of the time, evidence of supply, and the identification of materials and techniques. Finally, this leads to a discussion of the findings. The broken lined arrows indicate the cross-disciplinary information gained during research. For example, art history research was primarily undertaken to discover the cultural and historical aspects of the time. However, it also gives some indication into the material practice and supply of this period. For the purposes of brevity, I'm going to focus primarily on the archival research and the collection survey aspects of this project. Utilising archival resources as a means of identifying why materials were used can be just as informative as investigating the object directly. Michael Daly articulates in his 1993 article, The Varnished Truth, that despite the things we can learn from the technical examination of objects, analysis can only ever say what a material is, never what its purpose was. To derive meaning from Hyson, Bowen and Craig's choice of materiality, my findings also needed to be presented with contextual evidence of their personal circumstances. By applying a holistic approach to collection research, one can synthesize the connection between the material and the cultural. Documentary sources that were utilised for this project included records kept by the memorial concerning the artist's official commissions, lists of the materials supplied to these artists, and the correspondence between these artists and the memorial. Autobiographical information such as memoirs, letters, and interviews from newspapers and audio transcripts were also used for reference. Any insights gained while utilising archival papers for research must be complemented with an awareness of historical context, terminology, and the possibility of encountering mistakes within these documentary sources. In total, the artworks of interest acquired under the scheme encompass 57 paintings by Nora Heysen, 19 paintings by Stella Bowen, and 29 paintings by Sybil Craig. As seen in the table on the left, the memorial also holds a significant amount of works on paper, as well as works that have been acquired after the scheme. However, for the purposes of this project, I decided to focus only on paintings acquired during the scheme. The strategy involved collecting data from the digital catalogue and cross-referencing what support materials had been utilised by studying existing treatment photography of the recto and verso images. Works that lacked sufficient photography or information were viewed in person, and photography was taken to be uploaded to the memorial's collection management system. Collectively, almost 50 of these works were found to be miscategorised with incorrect or partially incorrect support material information. For example, a work with a support material that is actually oil on canvas on plywood may have been partially miscategorised as oil on plywood, or completely miscategorised as oil on wooden panel. The table on the left shows Stella Bowen's surveyed work. The colour coding represents the discrepancies between the pre-existing data and the actual materials. Red representing incorrect materials, green representing correct, and orange representing partially correct. These small errors may not pose a large problem to a conservator working with the artwork, as they would quickly identify the correct support materials and determine whether it made a difference to any proposed treatment. Nor may it be particularly problematic for the curator who wishes to display the work. But for the researcher, these discrepancies make data-driven discussion concerning the artist's use of materials challenging. As seen in the table on the right, of the 47 works with incorrect support information, this equated to 47% of Heysen's work, 45% of Craig's, and 37% of Bowen's. This creates a large discrepancy when using the catalogue data this way, and made the survey essential for utilising this information for research. From a data-driven perspective, understanding what the actual materials these artists were using is paramount to the understanding of their sense of choice, supply, and circumstance over time. During the survey, evidence of choice through material selection became clearer once the correct materials were allocated. Although there were many findings, I'm going to discuss a few key examples with conservation and art history application. One example is that many of Nora Heysen's work was regularly miscategorised as oil on canvas when it was actually oil on canvas on plywood. After cross-referencing Heysen's choice of subject matter with her actual choice of materials, it becomes more apparent that she set aside her canvas for portraits and opted to use canvas on plywood or pre-primed hardboard for landscapes. Using this newfound information, it can be hypothesized that Heysen had a preference for painting outdoor scenes on rigid material supports. This is likely because it was easier to transport and to work on these kinds of materials outside and on the field. Pictured here is an example of a work miscategorized as oil on hardboard when it was actually oil on canvas on plywood. These paint impressions on the reverse of the support were a recurring phenomenon in Heysen's works on this type of support, and they are likely due to her setting materials on top of palettes, perhaps because she had a limited workspace when painting. Evidence of commercial supply can be found in both archival documentation sources as well as direct physical examination. Supports may be bought ready-made from artist suppliers or be adapted from stationery and hardware materials such as paper or plywood. Stamps, labels, and embossing located on the reverse of paintings indicate the companies that manufactured and supplied these products, leading us to clues of their provenance. These labels from the late 18th century onwards are known as artist colourmen and can be used to date and locate where and when an artwork may have been made. Identifying commercial supply is beneficial towards a deeper understanding of an artist's choice of materials and, in turn, their circumstances. Of those painting supports with artist Cullerman stamps, this provided a direct link to their origins. As seen in the tables on the left, Stella Bowen used similar brands to Sybil Craig. However, being based in London, her materials were often of a specific war grade variety. This is interesting when considering the materiality and ongoing care for these objects. War-grade materials may age in a different way over time or require different treatment than their non-war grade equivalents. Here we can see an example of a Stella Bowen painting with a faint war-grade stamp on the reverse. This type of Winsor & Newton Academy board was a pre-primed, thinner version of a pre-war product. Subject matter, scale, and location were also cross-referenced. There was a clear correlation between subject matter and scale of supports, with portraits for all three artists tending to be larger works, whilst landscapes and images with figures at work being smaller. The majority of Craig's work, however, was found to be less than 50 to 70 centimetres. Juxtaposing this finding with archival knowledge, this was most likely because her method of transport to the munitions factory was via the Melbourne tram network, and her materials had to be portable. A finding which provides context to the art historical knowledge of Craig's work. Finally, one of the most interesting findings were these two works by Nora Heysen. Both originally miscategorized as being on canvas, they are actually on repurposed wooden panels. They differ to all of Heysen's other paintings, having panoramic dimensions, a lack of pre-prepared white grounds, and being painted over pre-existing damage and scratches. In a letter to her parents, Heysen describes finding a piece of board amongst the wreckage of a recent war zone in New Guinea. She writes, "Everywhere live bombs were still lying around, I found a very nice piece of board amongst the wreckage and put up my paint box on a piece of old school desk. I proceeded to paint the view." The location and details Heysen goes on to describe suggests that the artwork on the left is likely the artwork she was referring to, a notion that was not obvious while the work was categorized as being on canvas. In conclusion, performing a comprehensive material survey on the commissioned war work of Nora Heysen, Stella Bowen, and Sybil Craig was beneficial from a research perspective as well as a museum management perspective. Data-driven research has limitations based on migration techniques, digital upkeep, and human error. However, these problems can be improved upon and mitigated with the confirmation of supports and materials through a collection survey. Evidence of correct materials, as well as the supply and intent behind them, can be found through utilising available catalogue material, documentary sources, as well as an object-based examination. This form of methodology is both non-invasive and useful in combination with a holistic approach to art history research and the ongoing care of museum objects. Although the survey was limited, these existing data sets can continue to be built upon and complement each other, furthering our knowledge of war art and filling the gap in material knowledge concerning women artists from this era. In other words, seeking to non-invasively identify the materials employed by Heysen, Bowen, and Craig can not only further our understanding behind the context, conception, and intent of their work, but also provide contextual information to existing historical knowledge. Overall, the study provided invaluable insight into the material supply of Australian women war artists of this era, and how they made do and painted. Thank you for listening to this presentation.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me at this virtual symposium. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you from, which is the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. My name's Catherine Nunn. I've been a practicing conservator for the past 22 years and I run my own painting conservation business. I'm also undertaking doctoral studies at Melbourne University in art history and art conservation, and today I'll be speaking about my current PhD research. The title of my topic is Place, Cullerman and Cohort, Material Acculturation and Australian Expatriates in France, 1884 to 1915. My project explores the materiality of paintings produced by Australian artists working in France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the paintings at the focus of my research are, by definition, made by Australian artists, but not made in Australia. Today, I'll explain the methodological framework behind my study and report on the key findings to date. Broadly, my research involves examining the lives of Australian artists who went to France in the period to elucidate how they navigated the practicalities of being an art student in a foreign land with regard to their art materials. How they obtained and used art materials can be understood to be shaped by the forces that influenced them as foreigners negotiating their studies, careers, and personal lives in the city of Paris and beyond. The networks they operated in were central to shaping these elements. So, to set the scene for my project, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Australian artists travelled to France to study. Paris was then the capital of the international art world and attracted art students from all over the globe. The majority of the foreign artists in Paris were Americans, but there were also artists from Britain, Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, Japan, and Australia. And this quote from Australian painter Rupert Bunny, speaking to an Australian newspaper about the art world of Paris in 1911, reflects the motives of artists for this move. These artists are often grouped under the term Australian Impressionists. But when considering the art historical research on Australian Impressionism, scholarship has tended to focus on the years these artists worked together in Australia, painting the nationalistic subjects presented in popular exhibitions like the ones listed below. These exhibitions have not paid a great deal of attention to the artists who travelled to France, nor do they include any technical research about the paintings. And the latest iteration of Australian Impressionism at the NGV, Shiokan Sunlight, has just one room dedicated to the artists in France, but is not a wholly representative cross-section of the artists who went. As described by art historian Kathy Speck in 2017, the writing of art histories of Australian Impressionism has been constrained by a narrowly masculine and national orientation. This was a view echoed in a recent review by Rex Butler and A.D.S. Donaldson of Shiokan Sunlight, where the catalogue writers do not appear to be aware of or were simply unconcerned by all those new transnational questions being put to the writing of Australian art history, and that it's not just Roberts and Russell, but a whole series of Australian artists who went to France and spent time abroad internationally. My research plays a part in helping to address this problem by focused study of the cohort who spent time working in France and the transnational networks they operated in. As a conservation-focused study, I explore the materiality of the paintings produced when the artists were in France. In terms of previous technical study of these artists in France, there has been some written by conservators and published as exhibition catalogues, as you can see here. These exhibitions drilled down vertically to focus on the career of each individual artist, and technical study focused on individual artists in isolation, rather than exploring the networks of artists, as I'm doing. Post the 1980s and 1990s exhibitions, in 2013 there was a groundbreaking exhibition that focused on Australians in France, Eleanor Taylor's 2013 NGV exhibition Australian Impressionists in France. This was the first major exhibition to explore the networks of Australian artists who travelled to France, including some female artists. It opened up a new perspective to view the Australian art of this period, in line with what has been described as horizontal art history. My research builds on this base, and this is the approach I will take in my PhD. Not looking at a single artist, but looking at the networks of artists and their relationships and influence on one another as transnational artists. And the materiality of the paintings by this group of Australian expatriates has not been studied before. My research sets out to fill the gap in the technical art historical knowledge. It's a good time to be researching this. There have been several very recent art historical publications exploring foreigners in Paris. And these three recent publications focused on the foreign artists in Paris during the period. However, the common aspect of all these publications is that they are not technical studies. So there's clearly a gap which needs to be filled with some technical art history. So the broad methodological framework for my research is technical art history, but I also incorporate several other methodologies. The first of these is prosopography, which is an investigation of the common characteristics of a group of people whose individual biographies may be largely untraceable. And like many of the Australian artists who went to France, but who have been excluded from the dominant nationalistic and masculine-focused historiography. In the case of my research, Rupert Bunny is well known and documented, but someone like Marie Tuck, who is Bunny's assistant and student, is far less known. Likewise, Iso Ray, another associate of Bunny, whose works today command extremely high prices, has never had a book written about her. By examining these lesser-known artists alongside those well-known ones, more can be learnt about both the art history and the materiality of the period. Post-processual archaeology is another methodology I'm using, whereby accounts of the past acknowledge that material culture is meaningful and active in the construction of social relations. And by flipping this around, conservators can explore how the social relations of artists are active in the materiality of the artworks they produce. Material culture studies is another framework that's important for my PhD, and it's a branch of inquiry that evaluates the importance of an artwork based on what can be learnt from its context, the ideas behind it, as well as the forces that created it. And here, the sociological elements of the artist's lives can impact the forces that create the artworks. And of course, object biography is an important methodology when undertaking technical analysis. So, who were these artists who went to France? My research has discovered that in total, there were 55 Australian painters who spent time living and working in France during the period in question. And I've compiled this list from the various previous art historical studies on Australians in France, as well as some primary research of my own. Some artists came for just a few months or years, like Hugh Ramsay, while others stayed behind and became expatriates settling in Paris, like Bessie Davidson, or settling in the small coastal town of Étampes, like Isabelle and Iso Ray. Some artists came and went to Paris and Australia multiple times, dividing their lives between the two places, such as Kathleen O'Connor and Rupert Bunny. Many of these artists also spent time working and or living in the small coastal town of Étampes. Étampes was a popular artist colony for many Americans, British and Australian artists, and it's situated on the northern coast of France, north of Paris. There are about 30 Australian artists who visited or lived there, and artists came here from Paris during the hot summer months to paint the local landscapes and the local population. Like in Paris, some artists stayed for just a few weeks to study and paint, while others relocated to Étampes permanently. And some other artists stayed for shorter periods, such as Rupert Bunny, Marie Tuck, Hilda Rix-Nicholas, Eve Phillips Fox, and Tudor St George Tucker. And here we can see a contemporary postcard of the town and some of the Australian artists' paintings from the town. The French researcher Jean-Claude Lesage has written this fantastic book on the Australian art colony in Étampes, Peinture Australienne à Étampes. It's a fantastic resource for researching the Australians in Étampes, but once again, this book does not contain any technical study of the artists. Some artists in the cohort also travelled further afield to northern Africa, like Hilda Rix-Nicholas, who went to Morocco with the American painter Henry Ossawa-Tana. She stayed in the same hotel as Matisse, and they were painting there at the same time. Henry Ossawa-Tana lived in Étampes for a time, and he had previously lived in Paris at the same address as Hugh Ramsay, Ambrose Patterson, and J.S. MacDonald at 51 Boulevard Saint-Jacques. Hilda Rix-Nicholas's paintings from Morocco are important as they represent a technical departure from her paintings done in France, but can still be considered in the context of her French years. Materially, comparing these paintings is very interesting. And here we can see paintings from the Art Gallery of South Australia by Hilda Rix-Nicholas, the pink scarf, which was done in Étampes, and two Moroccan scenes from about 1914. Hilda Rix-Nicholas was a great correspondent and wrote every day to her mother, who stayed in Étampes while Hilda and her sister Elsie went to Morocco. These letters are preserved at the National Library of Australia, and many of her letters from Morocco reveal insights into her sourcing of artist materials there. Several letters point to her being able to access most of the art materials she needed locally in the markets of Morocco. However, she does ask her mother to send her some specific materials, which she names by brand, as she requires the specific material qualities unique to these particular products. And by comparing analysis of Hilda Rix-Nicholas's African paintings with hers done in Étampes in Paris, it may be possible to chemically identify different components of the paints and materials sourced from different locations. My research therefore aims to move beyond the previous art historical and nationalistic framework to a transnational and material-focused one. So my research questions are: where did Australians source their art materials from in France? And what impact does transnationalism and acculturation have on the technical aspects of their painting practice? How do the technical concerns of Australian artists in France relate to the sociological, temporal and spatial? And using technical analysis, can the location of a painting's creation be identified by the materials of its construction? So I'm using archival sources to inform my study as well as technical analysis of paintings. I'm currently compiling the datasets using samples taken from paintings in museum and private collections, and I'm analysing paint samples with optical microscopy, XRF, SEM-EDS, FTIR and Raman to identify pigments, mediums and coatings. Once the datasets are complete, I will use principal component analysis to explore the clusters and categories about materials and locations, as has been recently done by conservation researchers looking at Jan Steen's ground layers and locations. I'll also be using a mass spectroscopy technique to determine isotope ratios in paints as a way of linking materials with locations and chronology. So, to begin with the supply of art materials to foreigners in Paris, this has been a very under-researched area. There have been no specific studies to date looking at the supply of materials to foreigners. There has been some research on the development of the colourman industry in Paris by Rothmeyer and Sofio, and other sources compile lists of colourmen and their addresses, such as Jacob Simon's work at the National Portrait Gallery in London, which will be familiar to you all, as well as the NGV Colourman database by John Payne and Helen Gill, and Pascal Labroche's Guide Labroche, which provides histories, addresses and stamp examples of French colourmen. However, going straight to the primary source materials provides the most direct evidence of which colourmen were active in the period, and this includes documents such as the Salon catalogues, which are pictured here. My survey of the advertisements in the 30-year period from 1883 to 1913, the advertisements that were in the Salon catalogues, revealed that there were 23 different colourman firms advertising to the Paris market during this period. And this included well-known names such as Lefranc and Bourgeois, but also smaller, lesser-known firms. And while the Salon catalogues would have been read by both French and foreign artists, I'm specifically interested in the firms that targeted their marketing towards the foreign students in Paris. And there are some publications that are targeted to this group. These include the guide written by the Boston Art Students Association in 1887, and here we can see information about how to buy art materials and some of the big name colour merchants are mentioned here. And they also make the point that the merchants make semi-weekly and sometimes daily visits to sell to the students in the art schools. Other guidebooks are aimed specifically at women artists, such as this one, Studying Art Abroad, How to Do It Cheaply, by May Alcott Nerica, published in 1879. And she was the sister of Louisa May Alcott, who was the author of Little Women. This book suggests some colourmen and breaks it down even into where to go for specific brands of paint, for cheap colours, reliable colours, as well as painting supports. Another book published a bit later is Elizabeth Otis Williams' Sojourning, Shopping and Studying in Paris, a handbook particularly for women from 1907. And this book also includes discussion of several art material supply stores. A third example of a publication aimed at foreigners in Paris is the Quartier Latin, which was published from 1896 to 99. This journal is the publication of the American Art Association of Paris, who were founded in 1890. And the purpose of this organisation was to provide a meeting place, exhibition venue for American art students and others in Paris. And we know that Australians did have contact with Americans in Paris through these artist clubs and societies. And Henry Ossawa Tanner, who, as discussed, lived at the same address as Hugh Ramsay and others and also travelled to Morocco with Hilda Rix-Nicholas, was on the board of directors of this society. And this is a nascent area of research, also being worked on by Emily C. Burns in America, whose research is complementary to mine. Rupert Bunny was known to exhibit with these clubs, and he was a close associate of Mary Tuck and Issa Rae, among other artists, so we can extrapolate that the American influence also made its way to the Australians in Paris. And the first volume of this book, this publication, contains an ad for the Anglo-American Annual, which was a directory and handbook for residents of British and American nationality in France. And it contains information for British and Americans living in Paris, and no doubt this would have been useful for Australians too. I've not been able to locate a copy of this publication, but I'd be grateful to know if anyone in the audience has located it, because it would be great to see if there's also discussion of art supply stores in this publication. In the Quartier Latin, I have found just one advert for a colourman, that of Paul Fournet, and this is the only ad I've found for this firm. This firm later became Lefebvre Fournet in 1902, and interestingly, I did not find an ad for Paul Fournet or Fournet Lefebvre in the Salon catalogues, suggesting that the firm was marketing specifically to foreigners in Paris. The Quartier Latin also contained articles and stories written by American artists in Paris, this one by Lee Anson, where she talks about the huge variety of materials available to artists in Paris and that students swim in a sea of doubt and uncertainty. Contemporary reports of artists' lives in Paris also provide some evidence of colourman supply to art schools, as referred to in the Boston Art Book. Australian artist Alice Muscat, in her description of life as a student in Collarossi's atelier, which was published in several articles in the Daily Telegraph in 1896, describes that Angelo, a porter or an ex-model, comes in at intervals with canvases and paints which have been ordered. The men ply with him questions, orders and complaints. Colourman visits to art schools are also recalled by Julius Price in his 1913 My Bohemian Life in Paris, where he describes the student antics and daily routine in Gérôme's studio at the École des Beaux-Arts. He refers to the colour merchant Chabod of the colour shop in Rue Jacob coming round of a morning with a case of brushes and colours. He also says that there was no need to go out for anything because these colourmen would visit the school. And he even has an illustration of the colourman here with his box, his suitcase full of paints. Examples of the Chabod stamp are rare. However, I have seen one on this painting done by the first Australian artist to go to France in this period. And this was Eleanor Ritchie Harrison. She came to France in 1878, a whole 6 years before John Russell and Rupert Bunny arrived. She was the first Australian to come during this period, but she's not mentioned in any of the literature. She'd studied at the National Gallery School under Eugène Vongard, and here's an example of a painting by her, The Poacher's Daughter, in a private collection from 1886. And this colourman Chabod was evidently of good quality, as there's evidence that the Barbizon painters specifically requested materials from this firm. However, the firm Fournet Lefebvre is emerging as the dominant colourman for Australian artists in Paris. Fournet Lefebvre stamps have been identified on paintings by many Australians, and here we can see an example by John Longstaff. The stamps also been seen on paintings by Rupert Bunny, E. Phillips Fox, Margaret Preston, Hilda Rix-Nicholas, Hugh Ramsay, Bessie Davidson, Agnes Goodsir and Edward Officer to date. And results to date suggest that Fournet was primarily a supplier to the foreigners in Paris, whereas the French artists tended to use different colourmen. When I compared the stamps present on French artists' paintings in the NGV Colourman database, and this was Pissarro, Renoir, Fantin, Latour and Monet, none of these French artists from 1875 until 1908 used the Fournet firm. Instead, these artists use other French suppliers such as Hardy-Alain, Quentin and Troyes. And interestingly, these are suppliers who all feature prominently in the advertisements in the Salon catalogues, whereas no ad for the Fournet firm from this period has been identified in the Salon catalogues. So we can extrapolate that perhaps Fournet did market specifically to the foreign artists in Paris. Jacob Simon has also observed that the firm was used extensively by American artists, many of whom had trained in Paris, and more than any other colourman of the period, Fournet was used by British artists as a contact when exhibiting at the Paris Salon. And here we just have another example of a Lefebvre Fournet stamp on a Rupert Bunny painting. And here we can see some of the brushes in the Hugh Ramsay archive at the National Gallery of Australia, and they are all stamped with this Fournet Lefebvre stamp. There's another colourman who's emerging as potentially important for the foreigners in Paris. This is the Paris American Art Company. Elizabeth Otis Williams mentioned this shop in her 1907 book, saying it's a good place to go to buy art materials. But I'm yet to identify any Australian artists with this stamp on their paintings. So I'd be very interested and grateful if any of you in the audience have seen Australian paintings with this stamp on them. And here's just an example of the things they produce, little painting boxes and an ad in the Salon catalogue for the firm. Another colourman who's emerging as important for Australians in étapes is the photographer Caron Cousin. They were primarily a photography firm, but you can see they also supplied rolled canvases and stretchers and sketching stools to the artists who were working in étapes. Iso Ray corresponded with this firm, and Lesage refers to her as the firm as her colourman. I have not been able to track down this letter, but I'm hoping to be able to go to France next year and look into this a bit further. There's evidence that when the artists were working beyond the urban centres of Paris, outside their studios, they changed the materials they used, and these are some examples of Hilda Rex-Nicolas's Moroccan paintings. And she's clearly done these on a loose canvas that was pinned down onto a solid support. You can see here the evidence of the thumbtack here, where the thumbtack has masked the canvas and ground layer from paint. These have all later been applied to board, maraflaged, but the little pinholes are present in all of her paintings that she did in Morocco that I've seen to date. These pinholes are not to be confused with canvas spaces, which it seems Hans Huyssen probably used in this little painting that he did on the River Main, which is about 250 kilometres south west of Paris. These little spaces we can see here, the pinhole in the paint has been made when the paint was wet, rather than masking the area with a thumbtack. And there's evidence of these canvas pins in the Winsor & Newton catalogue. They're described as for carrying two wet pictures face to face. And when we compare this with the holes in Hilda Rex-Nicolas's paintings, you can see they're quite different. Similarly, when John Longstaff visited John Russell on the island of Belle-Île, he appears to have used loose canvas fragments rather than pre-stretched Fournet canvases like we saw in the Paris example. And these two paintings are from Castlemaine Art Museum. They are done on canvas, but both have been lined onto secondary supports. I don't know when this was done, but it of course obscures any identifying canvas features on the reverse. However, the canvases do seem very similar in weight and appearance, and when we compare the dimensions, we can see that the height of the larger work corresponds almost exactly with the width of the smaller work, suggesting that Longstaff cut both pieces of canvas from the same roll when he was on Belle-Île. And we can line them up here. There's also another work from his trip to Belle Isle, Morning Sunlight, Belle Isle, from the NGV collection. And again, this is on canvas. It's been stuck down onto a wooden panel. But when we line it up, accounting for the slight reduction in dimensions due to the lining process, we can see that they all appear to have been cut from the same roll of canvas. And this would make up a roll of canvas of about 80 centimetres in width. Further differences between Longstaff's Paris paintings and those done on Belle Isle can be revealed by paint analysis. Longstaff moved to Belle Isle corresponded with the influence of the painter John Russell on his work, and it appears to coincide with his adoption of a different green pigment. And we can see here cross-sections from both paintings. You can see on the Paris street scene it's just a chrome-based green, but when we compare this with the green used in Cabbage Plot Belle Isle, the XRF analysis shows clear peaks for arsenic and copper, which identifies the presence of emerald green. And his use of different greens reflects possibly his attempt to capture the bright light of the island versus the cold, wintry Paris street scene. Now, finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about a mass spectroscopy technique, laser ablation inductively coupled mass spectroscopy, that may be able to give me the precision I'm after to link materials to place in an analytical context. This is a method used to determine trace elements in a sample, often used in geological sciences to analyse trace elements in soil. And in painting conservation, it has been used to determine lead isotope ratios in paints to identify correlations between paint samples from different paintings. And in this way, it can be possible to identify if the paint sample from two separate paintings may have originated from the same artist's palette. It's been used by scientists at NICAS in collaboration with the Rijksmuseum to identify the sources of lead white in paintings by Rembrandt. And the team there is looking to expand analysis to 19th century paints, and they've offered to collaborate with me on my project. So I'm hoping to go to Amsterdam next year to do this, but I'm also investigating undertaking the technique at Melbourne University. So I've got a lot more I could say, but I'm over time already. So I'd just like to summarise and say that as you can see, I've been accessing primary sources for information about the supply of art materials to foreigners in Paris, and now I'm at the point of linking this with the artworks produced by the painters when they were there with materials analysis. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.